Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, coming up from Raleigh, North Carolina. If you don't know where that is, it's south of here. It's down in the Carolinas. And we actually have an art museum, and we have some wonderful art. And tonight I'm going to talk about the inspiration for an exhibition I did devoted to Caravaggio, and particularly his followers from Northern Europe, the areas of the Netherlands, both the northern and the southern Netherlands in the 17th century. But before we do that, we want to look at Caravaggio a little bit and get a sense of his art and what he brought to the plate, because he had an enormous impact on the art produced in Europe during the first quarter of the 17th century. We also have a quiz to start with. One of these two is a Caravaggio, the other one is not. Well, I know you all recognize the Cindy Sherman on the left. And it's not a leap of faith to be comparing these two works. Not only did Cindy Sherman use the Caravaggio, the so-called sick Bacchus that we see here on the right from the Borghese, but it, I think, leads into the issue of Caravaggio and his fame, because he was quite a character, to say the least. He, I think, raised a lot of eyebrows during his day in Rome and elsewhere, and to have a contemporary artist in his guise, if you will, would probably best suggest what, say, an Andy Warhol or a Jeff Koons or a Basquiat were doing with public acclaim and also in terms of their personas. So we start with this particular comparison. But let's focus on the Caravaggio briefly, because he is an artist who was not from Rome, but he arrived in Rome about 1592 without patronage, which means he basically was looking for work. And he was able to capture the attention of a particular artist, a man named Cesare d'Arpino, and he began to work in his studio, doing primarily still lifes and portraiture, and portrait-like genre or mythological scenes like you see here, this being one of the first great images that Caravaggio painted during this period. And it was during his, if you will, time in the studio of d'Arpino, before he was able to garner the attention of more important individuals, he explored a new style. And this new style was a style that was concerned quite a bit with a very strong visual representation, what we might call realism, but more correctly naturalism, but this wonderful observation. And it is a style that was beginning to displace, or at least one tendency in this style, to displace what had been happening in European art for most of the century, and that is Mannerism and its aftermath. An anti-classical style, a very unnatural style, if you will, for various reasons. But Caravaggio is bringing us back to this interest in naturalism. And this will mark his style during his years in Rome in particular, and it's this style that will attract all the great attention by artists throughout Europe. All these images are probably fairly well known to you. Here we have two more. Caravaggio's Lute Player from about 1595. That may in fact be a self-portrait. We don't know for sure, but he did like to dress up. We'll just leave it at that. And in dressing up, he presented himself in various guises and disguises, mythological musicians, etc. And we know that this was painted for a cardinal, Cardinal del Monte, and it was very well received. There was a great description of it by one of Caravaggio's competitors a little bit later in the century. And I think, again, further states his interest in representing nature. If you look at the flower still life, for example, and the wonderful description of the musical score and the violin and the lute playing, and even the reflection, the shadow of the hands on the belly of that lute there. Also, you'll note the raking light in the background. Light becomes a factor in Caravaggio's art after his first few years of training and working in Rome, and it will become really a characteristic that marks his art, and what is a characteristic that attracted so many of the great artists. Now, up to about 1595, Caravaggio was basically doing still lifes for hire, and these genre scenes and portrait-like genre scenes of the type you see here with the lute player. But about 1595, he began to have more important patronage and slowly focused his attention on religious art. And it was during the time of the Counter-Reformation when the Catholic Church wanted to bring people back into the fold, and they wanted their art to be more naturalistic. They didn't want the awkward proportions and the unusual compositions and the unusual coloring of Mannerist art. They wanted something that was truthful and really made a strong impact on the viewer, on the devout. And one of his first efforts in the area of religious painting is the work that you see here on the left. It's The Rest on the Flight into Egypt, painting of 1595 or 96 or so. It's also in Rome in the Doria Pamphili Gallery. And while it is somewhat awkward in the positioning of the figures, they seemed a little too crowded together. And the faces may not quite have that same sense of naturalism. They're a little mannered, a little bit stiff, but he is turning his attention, as I mentioned, to religious art. And if you look at the landscape around these figures, obviously it's an artist who's very much trained in observation. And this observation, as I say, carries throughout his art. But what he will do then in his great religious paintings to follow, and we'll bring two of the great compositions, the great pictures, from works he completed in 1600 and 1601 for two of the churches in Rome. Get my left and right straight. I'm left-handed, so I'm constantly wrong. Anyway, Calling of St. Matthew on the left, completed in 1600 in the Church of Santa Luigi del Franceschi, and on the right, a year later, the famous Crucifixion of St. Peter in the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo, 1601. These were two of his first great commissions. He did not only these two paintings for the churches, but he also did other works for the same church, so they were companion pieces. And by 1600, he really had now mastered the style that would bring him the great fame and bring him the great following, and made him, in essence, an early star in Rome during a time of the Baroque invasion, more or less. And in both of these, you can see that light is used to draw out the figures, the very strong directional cast light in the Calling of St. Matthew, and the more of a spotlight that you see on St. Peter. But this light picks up all the wonderful details, the naturalistic details from the grain of the wood on the cross that St. Peter is attached to the surface of the wall behind the figures, the costumes, and he's really ratcheting up the emotional content of these works through the use of light, through the realism, through the placement of the figures in the extreme foreground, through the fact that the backgrounds he has very little interest in even depicting. In the St. Peter, just a dark background and suggestion of landscape beyond or a rock formation. On the Calling of St. Matthew, just a wall with a window and a shutter, forcing things to the fore. And again, it's this strong Baroque element that you find in these compositions, particularly the diagonal of the light or the diagonal of the cross, which is really a characteristic of the Baroque. If you think of lines, you have horizontal lines, you have vertical lines that still are rather stable, but a diagonal line represents movement. And he brings movement into these figures, and again, it's both an internal emotional movement in the figures, but also the sense of the composition, the figures within this narrow depth of space. Now, what happens to Caravaggio as we go through the first 5 or 6 years of the 1600s, the first decade of the 1600s, is that his criticism of his art begins to assert itself, to the point that a number of his proposals and some of his paintings that were provided to churches on commission were not accepted. He had to do a second version, or someone else was given the commission after his work was turned down. And it began to impact certainly his emotional state, his temperament. He was never, from what we can tell in the few documents related to him, a particularly easy person to get along with. And when he was being criticized by artists such as, Baglioni, for one, who actually sued him on one occasion, other artists who said he was basically just the ruination of art. And he is working in an environment then that is finding things that obviously were displeasing him. Simple as that. What really was happening is that along with his illusionistic, dramatic, emotional Baroque response, there were other types of Baroque responses that were finding favor among the churches, among the major patrons. And one of these tendencies was more of a classical response. Classicism going back to the Renaissance and beyond, and there were a number of artists who were drawn to that avenue of Baroque art, and among them were the Caravaggio, who had their academy in Bologna. In particular, I'm showing you a work of Annibale Caravaggio here on the left. It shows Christ appearing to St. Peter on the road one day, or Domini Quo Vadis. If you compare these two works, and I'll get to the Caravaggio on the right in a second, note that the Annibale Caravaggio gives you more of a classical approach in terms of the figures, the costumes, the architecture behind. The coloring is much more in keeping with a Renaissance tradition. The figures, again, don't have that sense of naturalism that Caravaggio was bringing to his religious figures at the same time. And part and parcel, this was all adding up to, again, Caravaggio, in some ways on the outside looking in, even during his few years in Rome. And as I said, he had commissions that were turned down, and including the one that you now see here on the right. This is his famous Death of the Virgin. It's now in the Louvre in Paris. Dates 1605 or 1606. It comes at a very interesting point in his career, because in 1606 he actually killed someone, murdered someone over a wager on a tennis match. Agassi lost, so he killed somebody. And in doing so, he had to flee Rome. But prior to this happening, as I say, this criticism was mounting. And this is a great example, because when this was commissioned, he was to paint the Death of the Virgin, or at least a dying Virgin Mary. Instead of her dying, he basically shows a dead woman. And it's not any dead woman. It's a woman who had been fished out of the Tiber River. She was bloated. Her belly was swollen. And the clergy didn't like that, to say the least, and it was removed from the church because of her. She was swollen up and with bare legs. As I say, she was dead and not just dying. So it was removed, and this was happening with some frequency. There are other pictures as well, and with the fact that he killed someone, things were changing, and he had to go on the lam. And he went to Naples, and then he went to Malta, and he was constantly getting in trouble. Not a pleasant person, from all indications. But he certainly set a tone for at least one strain of Baroque art in Rome for about a decade and a half. Now, when we look at a couple of other pictures, I think the differences between the classical approach to Baroque art and the more dramatic, emotional, illusionistic approach to Baroque art can be seen in this here. We have the Caravaggio now on the left. It's the Supper at Emmaus, the early one that's in the National Gallery in London. Dates about 1600. And I'm comparing it to a work by the great classicist of the classicists. His name is Nicolas Poussin, a work that dates quite a bit later. This is 1640 or so. But I wanted to show you Poussin because Poussin actually wrote that, quote, Caravaggio must have been sent into the world to destroy the art of painting, unquote. So it kind of shows you that camps had been set up, Caravaggio against the classicists. And if you look at this work by Poussin, it shows the triumph of David after he has slayed Goliath, and the women of Israel are singing his praises, and he's coming into Jerusalem, but it looks like Jerusalem via the Roman Forum. But in any event, it has that very tight, controlled, classical organization of the composition, the palette, the gestures, the classical proportions of the figures. It's all part of that genre, if you will. Comparing it to a Caravaggio, which is pretty much in your face, both literally and figuratively. I mean, the two figures here, Christ was on the road to Emmaus with two of his disciples, and for some reason, this is after he had been crucified, and for some reason they didn't recognize him. for whatever reasons. But when he broke bread at dinner that night, they recognized what he was doing, and they were amazed that this was Christ, that he had, well, I guess you did recognize someone who died. That might have been a little. But in any event, looking at the table here, note that the two disciples, one is about to jump out of his chair, the other one has already thrown his hand into our space. And this is all part of this Baroque element to break down the boundaries between our space and the space within the picture plane. The basket of fruit, making reference to his great examples of fruit still life, is ready to fall off the edge of the table there. All these elements suggest that, we are a very fine line between our world and the world of the event here. Very unlike the classically inspired work by Poussin. I guess you're recognizing I'm a great fan of Caravaggio, but not so much Poussin at this point in time. So, now, what happens with Caravaggio, as I mentioned, he went on the lam. He went to Naples first, where he did a number of altarpieces and a few easel-sized pictures, including this work here, which is another Supper at Emmaus. And I wanted to bring this in. This painting dates just a little bit later. This is about 1606, so just about the time he's on the lam now. And note how different it is from the London picture on the left. It's as if he's drained color from the scene, and it's almost a ghost-like image. And while this may have added certain emotional depth to his figures and kind of backed off from the more illusionistic expression here, there's something very different in his art, and I think this has to be seen in the context of him having murdered someone, fleeing Rome. He would never return to Rome. He was eventually granted a pardon, but it came too late. He died after yet another fight and a fever. But it's interesting to see where he goes with his art. Now, what most of the artists who were attracted to Caravaggio did not see were the late works. They saw the works that were in Rome. So the Rome Caravaggio, the works from mid-1590s to 1605, 1606, they set the tone for those who followed. And to understand this whole idea of the late arrivals to America, you've got to see that Caravaggio was, in his own way, an early superstar of the art scene in Rome during this first decade of the 17th century, because many artists came to the north. And what we want to do is look at a few of those, and then we'll take we'll pick up the narrative about 350 years later when these works started coming to America. Now, a number were attracted to his art, although we know that Caravaggio was very adamant in the disdain he had for students. He wanted to have no followers, no immediate pupils. And the only artist who may have actually spent time in his workshop is a man named Bartolomæus Manfredi. And we have a work by Manfredi here on the right. It's a painting that is now in Dayton Art Institute in Dayton, Ohio. It dates about 1610, and it shows the allegory of the four seasons. And it's one of these handful of Manfredi paintings in America, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but what Manfredi did and what his contemporary in Rome did, a man named Gentileschi, Orazio Gentileschi, who did the Sibyl figure here on the left at about the same time, is that they began to adapt their work to the style of Caravaggio. And by that I mean the light-dark contrast, the forward figure placements, the emotional content of the scenes, isolating figures against dark backgrounds, these elements that are part of Caravaggio's art but became part of a larger movement. And with Manfredi in particular, you have an artist who actually may have worked in Caravaggio's studio. Perhaps he was wanted there or not, we don't know. But what's interesting, just a couple of decades later, there was another artist/writer, a man named Sandrart, who coined the term the Manfredi method. And while he never really defined the Manfredi method, he made reference to the fact that Manfredi was the intermediary who showed artists who came to Rome the manner how to produce works in the manner of Caravaggio, basically a Caravaggesque shorthand. And he did this through the use of tenebrism, the strong light and dark contrast that became rather filtered generalizing his figures, isolating the figures, forward placing the figures, these elements that he was able to show to many, many followers who were making their way into Italy at the time. Now, among his paintings, and I think one that captures this feeling very well, is the work on the left. This is another Manfredi. It's an Ecce Homo. Dates anywhere from 1610 to 12. Dating the works of Manfredi are very difficult because he did not sign and date any paintings. And he tended to work for a private market rather than religious commissions, so there's very little documentation on his art, so we kind of have to piece together a stylistic development, and there doesn't seem to be too much of one. So anyway, this probably dates 1610, 1612, and it's now in Memphis, Tennessee. It was acquired there not all that long ago. I think it was in the 1980s. And it shows, as I say, an Ecce Homo, but it shows a type of image and a style that probably helps to identify this Manfredi method, in that you have this tenebrous light. You have the generalized forms of the figures. They aren't specified in a way that Caravaggio brings in the specific to some of his individuals. There is almost an atmospheric quality that envelops these figures. And what's particularly interesting is as if there's a zigzag composition, moving from the figure on the far left up to Christ, back to another soldier, and then back up again. So in and out. And it helps to energize the forward plane of this composition. And what's interesting, when these other artists started coming to Rome, you begin to see that in some of their works. Wrong one. One artist you see it in very early on is a man named Dirk van Beburen. And Beburen is one of a number of artists from the Dutch city of Utrecht who made their way to Rome in the first decade and a half of the 17th century. And we know from documents that Beburen, a couple of others I'll mention, Terbruggen and Honthorst, lived in the same neighborhood as many of these other artists. So we know there had to have been contacts between them. And when you see this painting here on the right, it shows Christ crowned with thorns, a painting of about 1621, or done after he had returned back to Utrecht. I think you can see a bit of a sense of this Manfredi method. It's not quite as atmospheric, but just in the placement of the figures, it's moving in and out of the composition in almost a zigzag manner, in this very forward placement, in a painting that's been cleaned recently. This is a great painting that's in Kansas City at the Nelson Atkins Museum, and they have great examples, not only a work by Caravaggio, but by some of his great followers. It's been cleaned, and it's also interesting that this painting helps set the history of the arrival of Caravaggio and his followers into North American collections, because the Nelson Atkins was so important to have acquired one of the first great Caravaggios in this country. And then they acquired this in 1984, after I know the National Gallery passed on and a number of other museums. So it gets us a little bit into the history of collecting this material, perhaps not the great museums on the East Coast, but a lot of the museums in Middle America were beginning to collect this material going back to the period just after World War II. But I'll touch upon that a little bit later. Now, in addition to Beburen, the other and first of the great Utrecht painters to make his way to Rome to adopt the style of Caravaggio, perhaps through the help of Manfredi and even Gentileschi, as Leonard Slackus has suggested, one of the great scholars in this field, is a man named Hendrik Terbruggen. And here we have the earliest dated Terbruggen in the world. It's 1616. Or it came 2 years after he returned from Rome. We know that Terbruggen was in Rome from 1604, so before Caravaggio had left, and he was there for about 10 years. So he saw what Caravaggio and his followers were beginning to do. He was also seeing what the Carracci and the other tendencies in Baroque art were doing at the same time, and he came back to the north, and he created really masterpieces that not only shows this interest in Caravaggio, but one of the great things about northern artists is that when they went to Italy and saw Caravaggio and his works, they basically were seeing an approach to representation that was very consistent with northern painting as a whole, going back to the time of Jan van Eyck. If you think about the extreme kind of hyper-realism that you find in, say, Jan van Eyck's Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, the wedding portrait in London, or any number of works by Jan van Eyck and continuing right through Vermeer, there is this tendency towards this wonderful naturalism. So they were already primed for it, and Caravaggio just kind of pushed the pump down in terms of now the heightened tenebrism and the heightened drama and the heightened emotion. So you have Terburgen doing this in his early examples, the Supper at Emmaus, and again, it's a theme that we know Caravaggio treated on at least 2 examples. And his great colleague then, Gerrit van Honthorst, another Utrecht painter. And if you think about the big 3 of Utrecht, the so-called Utrecht Caravaggisti, it's Baburen, Terburgen, and Honthorst. And some of them spent their entire lives working in this manner, particularly Terburgen and Baburen, basically because they died very young. Honthorst moved beyond that. And here we see a Honthorst on the right. It's the Denial of St. Peter of about 1620, 25. It's in Minneapolis, one of the great examples of his work in America. And a theme, the calling of St. Matthew the calling of St. Peter when Peter denied Christ 3 times before the cock crowed. So you've got a late, just pre-dawn image that allows for candlelight illumination and the drama that goes with the art around Caravaggio. Now what's interesting, the northern Caravaggisti began to use candlelight as their light source. This is something you never find in Caravaggio. All of his light comes from stage left or stage right, normally stage left. So it's a light from outside the scene, whereas a lot of the followers tend to bring their own light source in, which again brings in a different type of illumination. I think you can see that here with the strong illumination on the woman and the St. Peter on the left of that composition who's denying he has known Christ. Now, you had then a number of painters going directly to Rome, in the case of Terburgen perhaps even meeting Caravaggio, but certainly responding to his art. You had others, however, who never went to Rome, and they learned it secondhand. And I can't overemphasize the fact that the word got out on Caravaggio quite rapidly. You think today, okay, we've got CNN and instantaneous news around the world. Things were a little bit slower in the early 17th century. But as early as 1603, you actually had a writer in Haarlem, a man named Karel van Mander, who is the Dutch Vasari, writing that wonderful things are being done by a man named Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio in Rome. So already in 1603, right at kind of the height of Caravaggio's career in Rome, he's able to write about this artist. A year later, Terburgen went to Rome. I'm not saying one prompted the other, but the word was getting out. Now, artists went to Rome, some did, but others stayed home. One artist who stayed home is a man named Abraham Blommaert. And I mentioned him because Blommaert was the teacher of many of these Utrecht Caravaggisti, in particular Honthorst, before they went to Rome. And what he was teaching them was basically a late mannerism. And we have here on the right a work that Abraham Blommaert did about 1610 or so. It's down the road in Princeton at the Art Museum there. And again, you have a late mannerist composition in terms of the elongation of the figures, the somewhat awkward posing, the palette kind of high pitch, typical of mannerism. This is 1610, but in 1627, without having gone to Rome, but responding to his former pupils coming back to Rome, he does this beautiful work from Toledo on the left. It's a shepherdess and a young shepherd boy reading a poem. And here you have the artist responding in a more forceful way to the concept of Caravaggism as he adapted it from his pupils. And it's rather interesting because he actually, let's move on to the next one, he actually began his career doing something like this. This is Blommaert a decade and a half before the painting on the right, and it shows Apollo and Daphne punishing the Niobe by killing her children. And this is full-flung, northern mannerism. I mean, it gets gory. You have about a crowding of a composition and awkward proportions and all that's going on at once. And again, things very much changed not only in Italian art with the introduction of Caravaggio's brand of the Baroque, but also this made its way to the north as well, even for artists such as Blomart who didn't actually go to Rome. And there are other ways in which artists learned about Caravaggio as well. This example, to take one, is another work by Caravaggio. It's the famous Madonna of the Rosary. It dates about 1606, probably done just before he left Rome to go first to Naples and elsewhere. This painting is now in Vienna in the Kunsthistorische Museum. What's interesting, however, is that this painting was in Amsterdam about 1620. It's one of these, a couple of examples of works by Caravaggio were actually seen elsewhere. This being one. There was actually a Flemish painter who was a court painter for the Duke of Mantua at the time, had recommended the Duke to buy it. Someone else was actually able to purchase this, an artist named Finsen, and eventually it made its way to Amsterdam and has now long since been in Vienna. But artists had the chance in this last lingering phase of Caravaggism to see works by this great master in the northern Netherlands without having actually have gone there, which is, you know, quite a rare occurrence. There was actually more movement of art across borders and across the Alps going back to the middle of the 16th century than one would think, but there were opportunities to see works by masters, copyists of these great works. For example, the Death of the Virgin that I showed you before that's now in the Louvre, that was actually bought by the Duke of Mantua before it made its way north, but who recommended that the Duke of Mantua buy it? Peter Paul Rubens. So there are all these connections between some of the great masters of the 17th century. Speaking of Rubens, here we have two works. I won't trick you again. One is by Caravaggio and one is by Rubens. On the right, you have a copy of Caravaggio, or at least a partial copy of Caravaggio's entombment that's now in the Vatican collections that you see here on the left. The entombment by Caravaggio dates to 1604. It was described by even Caravaggio's critic Baglioni, who sued him, I think, 2 years later, as the artist's best work. And it certainly has a great history to it. In 1797, it was plundered by the troops of Napoleon and sent to Paris. It went back to Italy in 1815 and made its way to the Vatican. Many artists had seen it in Rome and elsewhere and made copies, and certainly the artist who's best known and the most Catholic as well probably is Peter Paul Rubens, who did this study after it, which is now not far from here in Ottawa at the National Gallery of Canada. And he seems to have painted that towards the end of the first decade of the 17th century, about 1610 to 15 or so. Here's one more Rubens to see how Rubens could then adopt the style for his own use. If you look at the great painting here, the Samson and Delilah, the National Gallery in London bought no more than about 15 years ago, if that, painting of about 1615, you see really a painting that I think identifies itself as a Rubens. The amplitude of the figures, kind of the metallic quality of the paint application, the detail of the drapery. It has a very Rubensian quality to it, but at the same time, if you look at the placement of the figures and the quality of the light, it's an example where Rubens is paying homage in a way to a Caravaggesque style. This came about half a decade after Rubens himself had returned from 8 years in Italy, having seen Caravaggios, having seen the Renaissance, having seen almost everything, and began to include that into his art. So Rubens went through a Caravaggesque phase in the period after briefly after he returned from Italy. And then there are other artists who seem even farther removed, but at the same time have a Caravaggesque sense to their work, and they can be as diverse as Rembrandt van Rijn, that you see here on the left, an early work by Rembrandt in Berlin of 1627. This is a man inspecting a coin. And on the right, a follower, if you will, or a contemporary of Rubens, a Jacob Jordans. The Jacob Jordans is actually from my museum down in Raleigh. It's one of two versions of this composition. I think it's the better version than the one in the National Gallery of London, but it shows the Holy Family with St. John and his young St. John and his parents. And the Rembrandt, as I say, note that in their own way, certainly different palettes and different descriptive qualities to their brushwork, but at the same time, you note the placement of the figures and the quality of the light and the disinterest in the background, and certainly an emotional tenor in one respect or another. In both of these scenes, you have artists who at least outwardly make their way back to Caravaggio's great innovations. And it's all part of this northern culture, and again, they're feeding on each other, both what Caravaggio had been doing in Rome and all his followers were doing, but also this northern tradition of observation. So these are coming together. So while we know that neither of these artists went to Rome, in fact, Rembrandt and his colleague Levens actually mentioned in a interview of a type that they didn't even need to go to Italy because they could see plenty of Italian art in the north. Now, I'm not saying he's speaking of the Caravaggios that made their way to Amsterdam, but we do know that in 1639, Rembrandt made a copy after a Raphael that was in Amsterdam at an auction. So he was looking and making reference to art from Italy. And again, I think this is part of the larger picture that's taking place at this time. Now, at my museum in 1998, we did an exhibition devoted to this idea of Caravaggio and his great influence on northern artists. We called it Sinners and Saints because mostly they were sinners and you had a few saints thrown in. But the whole idea of darkness and light brought into the scene, and I think it was a very beautiful work. We have many works in our collection that kind of tie into this theme. But when you do an exhibition, exhibitions are basically boiling down what you can get for a show and what you can't get. Now, I was lucky in that we had a core group of paintings from our museum that I could count on our director lending. If not, I probably wouldn't have worked there much longer. But to have a show which has Caravaggio in the title, you have to have a Caravaggio. And in getting a Caravaggio, it started this whole process of trying to come up with an idea of, how many Caravaggios are in this country, when did they come, and how many can I get my hands on? Now, it turns out there are only 7 in this country. There are only 5 that come from his Roman period, and to get even one was going to be a major effort. I did get one. It's the work in Kansas City that you see here in the slide on the left, actually. But before we get to that one, I do want to talk about this idea of Caravaggio and his acceptance in America and really around the world in the period between the time that Caravaggism began to die out, which is about 1630 in the north, 1620 in Italy, and the 20th century. Because in the centuries between, Caravaggio did not have a great impact on the direction of art. He had that brief moment, kind of a rising superstar, and this great following, but then classicism won out after a while. New styles came. It's kind of this continuing thing that goes on and on. But really, what happened by the time you get into the 19th and early 20th century is that you had great collectors and the founding of the museums in America and elsewhere, the public museums going back to the mid-19th century, scholarship and everything, really focusing not on the Italian Baroque, but on the Italian Renaissance. And Raphael was king, and everybody kind of fell under his wings, if you will. You got to Baroque art, it was seen as just an abomination. Also, it's almost as if the criticism that Poussin had lashed out towards Caravaggio was being applied to all of Italian Baroque art. In fact, in an exhibition of this material that Professor Spear, professor up in one of the universities in Ohio, did in 1971, he mentioned that probably the only artist from the Baroque period that most Americans or any Americans would really know would be Caravaggio. And even at that point, there were only a few Caravaggios in the country. Now, the first Caravaggio to enter the country that was a legit, bona fide Caravaggio is the work that you see here on the right. It went to the Wadsworth Atheneum, one of the first public museums in this country. It's a great painting from about 1595, one of his first religious works. And this came to the country in 1943. So it wasn't until 1943 that you have a Caravaggio in America. Now, if Caravaggio is only beginning to scratch the surface during World War II, you can imagine what the followers were doing. They were totally off the map. Terbruggen, Hontorst, almost all these others. If they came into a collection, it was almost by accident. It's certainly not by choice. So what the exhibition that I did focused on were these paintings that came from North American collections, Canadian, American, mostly public collections, but a few private collection works. And it's really fascinating when you kind of plot what artists were popular first and then, how were they displaced. Now, the second Caravaggio to enter America came to the Nelson Atkins in 1952. And that's the painting that you see here on the right. It's the St. John the Baptist from about 1604 or 5. And to give you a sense, first of all, what Caravaggio was doing as a painter compared to what had come before, because a fairly contemporary work, only dating about 10 years earlier, is the St. Sebastian by a Dutch artist named Joachim Uteval here on the left. It dates about 1595. This is also in Kansas City at the Nelson Atkins. You have a Mannerist composition, largely single figure, and then you have the deep, brooding, penetrating, emotional, descriptive, dramatic Caravaggio's image of St. John the Baptist on the right. Now, the St. John the Baptist was included in an art exhibition in the early 1950s in Italy. And it was pretty much rediscovered as a Caravaggio at that time. And one could do an entire lecture on Caravaggio attributions because it's a major question mark in the history of art and collecting. But this was recognized as a genuine Caravaggio, and they were able to present documents on who commissioned it and where it was placed for centuries, and it's on the art market. And the Metropolitan was offered it. The Metropolitan here in New York, they passed on it. And then it was offered to the Kress Foundation, largely buying for the National Gallery in Washington. They passed on it because this painting was too expensive in 1952 for $75,000. A trustee at the Nelson Atkins happened to see it in the window of the dealer named Agnew in London in 1952, saw it and decided that they would get it for the Nelson Atkins. And that's why you have the second great Caravaggio in America going to the Nelson Atkins and not the National Gallery or the Metropolitan. The Met gets its chances, though, because as the years passed, it wasn't long, and almost at the same time, just after the Nelson Atkins bought their Caravaggio, then the Met came to their senses, so to speak, and they bought the musicians that you see here on the right in 1990, or a painting of 1594-95, and they bought this in late 1952. I'm not sure what they paid, but it's the other side of the coin. You have a great religious altar piece in the Nelson Atkins. You've got basically a genre painting here at the Met. And it's the first of 3 now that the Met has in their galleries. A number of other museums have been able to buy into Caravaggio and his fame. Cleveland in 1976 bought a Naples period crucifixion of St. Andrew that you see here on the left. You can begin to see the colors beginning to drain out of it. Again, typical of Caravaggio after he leaves Rome. And then you have this painting here, which was bought as a Caravaggio quite a bit earlier by the Chicago Art Institute back in the 40s. They thought this was a Caravaggio, and if it had been, they may have won the prize. But this is actually another work by Manfredi, and it's Cupid Chastised, dates about 1605 or 10, and it gives, again, I wanted to bring that in because there were lots of paintings that were thought to be Caravaggio that had entered America in the early part of the century, but it wasn't until the Wadsworth Atheneum painting came that we have one that most all experts agree upon. Certainly this has fallen by the wayside. It's a fabulous painting. Has a little bit of Caravaggism, a little bit of late mannerism to it. It's playful in its own right, and one of the great examples by Manfredi in this country. Now, we've talked a little bit about Manfredi and Manfredi method, and as I mentioned, one of the first artists who came into Rome from the north that began to really deal with the whole concept of Caravaggism is a man named Hendrik Terbruggen. And once scholarship had advanced to the point where Italian Baroque was A-OK to study for the most part. In fact, there wasn't even a history of Italian Baroque painting in English until the 1950s. You had people, scholars, collectors, and rather forward-looking museum directors beginning to look at Caravaggio and his followers. Now, Caravaggio, in relative terms, were very expensive and very rare. But some of the smaller museums, some of the university museums, even some of the private collectors in the period just after World War II were beginning to come to terms with the quality and the extreme dramatic depth that you find in many of these great paintings by some of these Caravaggesque artists. And one of the first artists that people began to look at very seriously, and partially this was due to a monograph on him by an English author named Nicholson, was Hendrik Terbruggen. And one of the first Terbruggens, not the first, but one of the great, and certainly the greatest Terbruggen, I think, possibly in the world, is in America. It was acquired in 1953, and you have to go to Oberlin, Ohio to see it. It's in the Allen Art Museum. It was acquired by their director, and probably through the help of one of the great scholars of Northern art, a man named Wolfgang Steckau, who had taught at Oberlin for many years. And you have here Saint Sebastian and Irene, which is just, Saint Sebastian has been shot full of arrows, gets nursed back to health, only to see another day in which he's killed. But anyway, just the tenderness between the two figures. And then Saint Anne, I've heard another saint, helping him take Saint Sebastian down. It has this wonderful smoky quality to it, probably through this Manfredi method, but just the presentation of the figures and the sympathy that you have for these figures and the drama and the lighting, it just shows you that Terbruggen, certainly not an everyday name, is really one of the great masters of 17th century Dutch art. And it's interesting that these followers of Caravaggio, Terbruggen, Babur, and Honthorst, they didn't make their way to America until long after there were 30, 40 Rembrandts in this country. Peter de Hoog's, Frans Hals, people were collecting Dutch paintings of the type that we think Dutch painting should be. The landscapes, the still life, the portraits, Rembrandt, but these kind of fell by the wayside. And once the floodgates were opening, a number of museums started buying great works by Terbruggen, including the Metropolitan. They acquired this in 1956, work on the right. It's a crucifixion of about 1625. Just looking at it today, they hang it kind of in a corner by a doorway. I could find a better spot for it because it really is a very moving image, and it also shows Terbruggen, I think, a little bit more firmly planted in his northern tradition. He's responding as much to printmakers and artists such as Lucas van Leyden from the 16th century as he is from 17th century. But again, it's just a stunning work here in New York to see by this artist. And it's one of the rare and the earliest Terbruggens that made its way into an East Coast collection. Now, when you think about, and we're running a little short time, when you think about the acceptance of northern followers of Caravaggio into American collections, the Dutch and the Flemish. What's interesting even today that the two museums that have the most diverse holdings in this area, the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh and Bob Jones University in South Carolina, because of its religious bent, those museums hadn't even opened in 1950. Raleigh opened its doors in 1957, I think Bob Jones a couple of years later, and they were collecting material that was accessible still on the market for fairly low prices. Because in the 50s and early 60s, Terbruggens could still be bought for very modest prices compared, say, to Caravaggio. So in Raleigh, for example, we have two Terbruggens. We have the work on the right, which is David being praised or sung to by the women of Israel, as he enters Jerusalem with the head of Goliath, a scene that we saw Poussin do in a work a little bit earlier in the lecture. And then a painting here on the left from Bob Jones University that is probably not Terburgen, it's probably by a workshop follower. And we know that many of these artists had many versions of compositions that they and workshop may have done. You have prime versions, you have autographed copies, you have studio copies. I think this might be a studio copy, but I just wanted to bring these two in because these museums were able to buy. Now, I know when Raleigh opened its doors, it didn't have a huge collection, but it did have great Caravaggios because they could afford it, or in the case of the Terburgen on the right, it was given to us by the Kress Foundation. In fact, both of our Terburgens were. Smith College acquired a Terburgen. This is this wonderful image of an old man writing that came in 1957. Another university acquiring a Terburgen at a reasonable price in the 50s. And again, note the candlelight illumination and the great details. I mentioned, and this is thanks to Carol Robb, the shadow of the hand on the belly of a lute by Caravaggio. Note the reflection of the candlelight coming through the eyeglass and kind of asserting itself on the upper cheek of the man here. Again, this wonderful observation, but at the same time, this very broadly painted quality you find in a lot of the details of this. But it's just a stunning image. Again, it's about 2 feet tall, something along those lines, whereas the work on the right is much larger. Now, in addition to Terburgen, who, again, I will call the poor man's northern Caravaggio, when you think about collecting in America in the 1950s and early 60s, you have Honthorst, and here we have a 1617 or so painting by Honthorst, which is now in Cleveland, shows Samson and Delilah. That was acquired in 1968. People were beginning to respond to Honthorst a little bit later than Terburgen, a decade or so later. You have this painting, and then you have one of my favorites up in Montreal, a singing couple, or as I like to say, this isn't choir practice. 1624, Museum of Fine Arts in Montreal, and this was acquired in 1969. So Honthorst was beginning to assert his presence, at least in a collecting capability at that time. And again, in both of these, I don't think I need to go into how Caravaggios they are in terms of their lighting and composition and the drama involved. And then Honthorst, unlike Baboren and I briefly mentioned Terburgen, decided to live a couple of extra decades. These other guys died off fairly early, but Honthorst lived on. And in 1632, I just think this is in backwards actually, it doesn't seem right. He was doing a work such as this that the Toledo Art Museum acquired in 1993 from a private donation. And now his light has become more silvery, his technique is more classical in terms of a tighter, more controlled brushwork. It's not quite as dramatic in terms of figures kind of falling out of the picture plane. So he is, again, moving towards a classicism that would begin to assert itself in a lot of history painting as you move into the 1630s. Now, if Terburgen was the poor man's Caravaggio, once the Terburgens got very expensive, who became the poor man's Terburgen? It is a man named Matthias Stome, or Stomer. And here we have two Stomes. There have been a lot of activity in the market for this man, Matthias Stomer, who is from the northern Netherlands but spent most of his career in Italy, Rome, and further south. In the last decade or two, an example, the Christ and the Woman Taken into Adultery that we see on the left was acquired by Montreal in 1993. There's another major painting, I didn't bring the slide in, of the Calling of St. Matthew that San Francisco acquired a little bit later than that. I was just at a dealer today, I saw a great stone that's on the market. If anybody wants to drop $400,000, let me know. I'll give you his name. But what's nice about our museum down in Raleigh is that we acquired a stone back in 1952. We were even poorer than the poor man's Terburgen at the time. So for just a couple of $1,000s, we acquired this Adoration of the Shepherds in Raleigh, and it's one of our Caravaggios paintings. Now, in thinking about Caravaggio, you know, that brief period he was in Rome and then attracted this great following, how long did this last? Certainly you had Northerners coming in the by the end of the first decade, and they continued the tradition through most of the 1620s, particularly in Utrecht, but with ripples being seen in Amsterdam with Rembrandt or Frans Hals or others. But even a half decade or a half century later, you can still get a sense of what's happening. And if you look at this picture, you probably all know this picture now because it's in the Vermeer exhibition. This is an early Vermeer, and Vermeer wanted to be a history painter, at least from his first few canvases. And in many ways, his large-scale figures and their forward placement, and even the light he suggests, gives you an idea that a Caravaggesque approach is not too far from his mind. And maybe even in some of his subject matter, because this is another early painting by Caravaggio, Vermeer. This is a Procurus that was also in the Vermeer show here, Vermeer in the Delft School. A signed and dated painting of 1656, or within a year of the work on the left, which is Christ in the House of Martha and Mary, Edinburgh on the left, Dresden on the right. And again, here I think you had even more of a Caravaggesque quality, kind of that, larger-than-life figure, the objects kind of hanging over the edge of the table into our space, a disinterest in background, even the subject matter, for many of the followers of Caravaggio, has that kind of edge to it. And Vermeer is trying to do that. Now, how can we tie Vermeer really back to Caravaggio and the Utrecht Caravaggisti? It's actually fairly easy, because when we think of mature Vermeer, and this is a painting that no one's seen for a decade. This is a painting by Vermeer that was stolen from the Gardner Museum in Boston. You have a concert taking place, and it seems very, on the up and up, and this beautiful description of space and musical instruments and table carpets, and you have the couple. But on the back wall, there's a painting. There are actually two paintings. But the painting on the right on that back wall is of some significance, because that painting is, if not this painting, a version of this painting, which used to be, well, still is, in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. You could actually walk across the street from one to see the other, because this painting on the back wall is another Procurus scene, just not dissimilar to what we just saw Vermeer paint here, if you want to look at Vermeer's Procurus. It's a little bit more racy. It's one of my favorite Caravaggesque works. This is by Dirk van Baburen. We've seen a couple of Baburens already. This is also a painting, again, came to America. But there aren't that many Baburens. He died in 1624, quite young. But there are a handful, and Boston has one of the greatest and most important. I also like this painting because the middle figure looks like Kirk Douglas to me. And maybe Michael a little bit, but in any event, with a beard. But this is the painting that appears in the background of the painting by Vermeer that maybe tells you a little bit more in a prescriptive way what Vermeer is saying about this kind of above-board concert that's taking place between the couple. There's something else going on there. There's a subplot. But in any event, Vermeer seems to have been a picture dealer, and we know his father was, so Vermeer may well have owned the painting by Baburen that was painted in the early 1620s that he included in one of his paintings of the 1660s. That is now in Boston, and originally the painting that you saw on the right was across the street in Boston at the Gardner. So there's a certain continuity in this interesting Baburen, while it was a brief shining moment, or in Caravaggio, while it was a brief shining moment, it nevertheless had lingering effects for generations, including the great art of Vermeer. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you very much for your attention.